when we try to analyze the coming to power of Donald Trump, what we should also be doing is looking at what was the alternative to him in the previous 8 years under Barack Obama, and what would have been Hillary Clinton's policies if she had won, because she was a successor to Barack Obama. And I think when we do that, we'll see that Barack Obama wasn't actually that great for Ukraine. In terms of, you've had about 4 U.S. presidents since 1991. Barack Obama, to me, would be on the same plane, just a little bit better than Bush Sr. in the early 1990s. Both were, at the beginning of their presidencies, Russia first. They thought Russia was a priority, not Ukraine. And they were very much not really supportive of Ukraine. The best presidents were Bill Clinton and Bush Jr., who had a very different approach to Russia and Ukraine than his father. But Obama, in that sense, we have to, and we tend to forget, because it seems like a million years ago with everything that's happened, is that in 2009, when Barack Obama came to power, he began with his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, a so-called reset of relations with Russia. Now, good relations are always a nice thing to have in international relations, but at the same time, this came just after, literally months after, Russia's invasion of Georgia. And after Russia's invasion of Georgia in August of 2008, Russia de facto annexed South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It recognized their independence. It's led to an outcry. And Viktor Yushchenko, I may be critical of him, but on this occasion he was absolutely right. He traveled down to Tbilisi with the Polish and Baltic presidents and to give his support to Georgia. Now, it's ironic, of course, that the president of Georgia at that time, Mikhail Saakashvili, is now in Ukraine, and he's challenging Petro Poroshenko. So, in Ukraine, we have a Georgian government in exile, and in Russia, you have Yanukovych government in exile. But nevertheless, this reset with Russia was wrong on the part of Obama and Clinton, and it was their way of basically saying we're going to be different to Bush Jr. and Dick Cheney, who was very anti-Russian. We're going to approach this Putin question, Russia question differently. It was wrong because, Putin got away with invading Georgia, and there were no sanctions imposed on Russia after the invasion of Georgia and the de facto annexation of those two territories. And many experts, including myself, would argue that Putin was emboldened by getting away with invading Georgia, thinking that if he did the same thing in Ukraine later on in 2014 and he annexed the Crimea, then again the West would turn a blind eye. Nothing would happen. Now, he was wrong, but the initial reaction of the West to what happened in the Crimea was very meek, and it was only after the shooting down of MH17 in July of that year that the West ratcheted up the sanctions. So Putin was wrong there, but at the same time, it was also wrong of Obama and Hillary to try and reset relations and to let Russia off the hook, as it were, for its invasion of a sovereign country, Georgia. Another point we should also remember is that Ukraine would be in a better military position today, and maybe would have tried to retake some of those territories occupied by Russian proxy forces if President Obama had not vetoed the sending of military equipment to Ukraine. It's a big plus that both U.S. political parties, Democrats and Republicans, and in both houses of Congress voted in favor of the sending of military equipment to Ukraine. But President Obama vetoed that. And what was his reason for vetoing it? Well, his reason for vetoing it was that, we have to give the Minsk process time to work. Now, give me a break. Nobody, including Poroshenko, I think, ever believed the Minsk process would actually work. Poroshenko, I think, signed it because it was a way of getting time when Ukrainian forces were in a very difficult position, so gaining some momentum and time. And Putin certainly had no intention of fulfilling the Minsk agreement, and he still to this day hasn't. And in fact, between Minsk I and Minsk II, he beefed up separatist ragtag forces into an army of 35 to 40,000 troops, which is bigger than half of NATO's 28 members' armies. So the idea that Putin would implement Minsk is not true. But the fiction of we have to wait till Russia complies with Minsk has been this bogeyman, as it were, preventing the sending of military equipment to Ukraine. Because if Europe and Barack Obama admits that Minsk process is not working or hasn't worked, then they have to then go to Plan B. And what is Plan B? Well, then maybe we have to allow the Ukrainians a military option. So this has been a fiction all along. And they keep saying that sanctions will be lifted if Russia implements Minsk. Russia will never implement Minsk. Never. I mean, if Russia was to implement the Minsk agreements, it would basically be saying that it no longer supports the separatists. And if it did that, Ukrainian forces would defeat the separatists and would retake the territory. They were able to defeat the separatists in the summer of 2014, and the separatists were only saved by a Russian invasion. If the threat of a Russian invasion goes, if Russian forces are withdrawn, the separatists will be defeated. In this sense, Ukraine is very different to Moldova, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, where the central governments are not in a position to defeat the separatists. In Ukraine, they are in a position to defeat the separatists. And the only thing that's blocking that is a Russian guarantee of security to the separatists. Minsk removes that guarantee, and that's why Putin will never implement Minsk. But the West is pretending this fiction is there. It's a complete fiction. But that fiction prevents the sending of weapons, and Obama's been playing on that fiction. Another factor is that besides the Minsk question, is that let's remember that what happened in 2014 affected the security of a country that gave up the world's third largest nuclear weapons arsenal in 1992 to 1996. Ukraine inherited the second largest nuclear force after Russia from the USSR, both tactical and strategic weapons. The tactical weapons went straight away back to Russia. The strategic weapons took a lot longer. And in return for giving up those nuclear weapons, Ukraine was to receive security assurances. Kuchma didn't get guarantees. He got security assurances from the world's nuclear powers, primarily Britain, US, and Russia. France and China only kind of signed as observers, not really fully. But what do we have? We have a bizarre situation where the aggressor country, who completely infringed the Budapest Memorandum on the security insurances, Russia, is a party to peace negotiations, when the two countries that are part of the Budapest Memorandum, the US and Britain, are not there, are not present, which is absolutely ludicrous. So in this sense, Barack Obama betrayed Ukraine. He didn't insist that America should be part of that negotiation process. And if America had been there, the pressure on Ukraine would have been far less to comply with Russia's demands. Because often Ukraine felt that France and Germany was ganging up with Russia against Ukraine. So, I mean, I think in this sense, it was incumbent upon the British and the Americans to fulfill their requirements to the Budapest Memorandum to be part of that negotiation process over security questions on Ukraine, which have given up all those nuclear weapons. I mean, just think now, if you're a nuclear weapon country, why the hell would you believe a word that the West says about its security, and if you give up nuclear weapons after what's happened to Ukraine? Ukraine gave them up, and he got nothing really in return. So I think here Obama, again, in his sort of lack of interest in international relations, in his kind of willingness to basically delegate the Ukrainian question to the Europeans was highly mistaken. In that sense, he was very much hands-off Ukraine, and he is the only US president that's never traveled to Ukraine. Even Bush Sr. went to Ukraine. Remember the old Chicken Kyiv speech in 1991? But Obama is the first US president who didn't go to Ukraine. So we'll see if and when Trump visits Ukraine. Another factor, which I think is related to that Budapest memorandum, is that the Minsk agreements, or both Minsk agreements, never included any mention of Russia's annexation of the Crimea. And the reason for that is obvious, because on the one hand, the US and Britain were not party to the negotiations at Minsk, and on the other, the aggressor country, Russia, was. And so Russia had this fiction that, on the one hand, Crimea is not an issue because 98% allegedly supported annexation or reunification with Russia, whereas in the Donbass we don't have any troops. Both are lies, but both impacted upon the Minsk agreements, and the Crimea is not even mentioned once in there, which is, of course, is a dangerous question there. Because does it mean down the road that the West will Donald Trump, the US president, accept Russia's annexation of the Crimea, as he hinted he might during the primaries? And on a final note, I mean, all of this is in some ways related to Obama's disinterest in foreign policy and international relations. So his weakness in the international arena is something that not only the Ukrainians and the Poles and the Baltic states have complained about. It's something that's more broader in the Middle East and elsewhere. And when you leave a vacuum, like in Russia's neighborhood, that inevitably is going to be a vacuum into which Russia will try to step in and try to do its dirty work and try to do regime change or invasions and such like. Russia loves those power vacuums. The Russian Yanukovych mentality is far more one of respecting hard strength and power. And in that sense, Donald Trump in the primaries was correct in saying that Obama comes across as weak. I mean, many countries in the world believe that, and they see that in the Middle East. Remember his so-called red lines in Syria that became a laughingstock in the case of Russia, and now Russia's leading the way in Syria. So in this sense, Obama's hands-off on foreign policy and then his delegation of Ukraine to the Europeans, to two countries in particular, France and Germany, which always have had very big pro-Russian lobbies, has been not good for security in many parts of the world. One understands the Americans always have a problem because, they can be either sometimes perceived as cowboys like Bush Jr., or they can be perceived as too hands-off in the case of Obama. In the middle were people like Bill Clinton, who wasn't a cowboy, but he also was hands-on vis-a-vis Ukraine. And in that sense, Obama comes across as weak. How Hillary Clinton would have looked like if she'd have been elected president is unclear. She may have had a more robust foreign policy. But the Ukraine diplomats will always have told you that Obama's hands-off is something that leaves gaps in security and vacuums into which Russia enters. And if, the famous joke is that, a Russian leader goes along a corridor, he opens the first door, there's somebody inside and they say, get out. He doesn't go in. He opens the second door, there's nobody there, so he goes in and occupies the room. They do respect hardcore strength, and that wasn't something that came across from President Obama. He seemed, in some ways, President Obama came across as an ivory tower academic, kind of out of touch with a lot of what the world looks like, and the cynicism and raw power of the Russians and maybe the Chinese. Thank you.